The scripture this morning comes from the book of Daniel, chapter 1, verses 3 through 8 and 12 through 20. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, his chief of staff, to bring to the palace some of the young men of Judah's royal family and other noble families who had been brought to Babylon as captives. Select only strong, healthy, and good-looking young men, he said. Make sure they are well-versed in every branch of learning, are gifted with knowledge and good judgment, and are suited to serve in the royal palace. Train these young men in the language and literature of Babylon. The king assigned them a daily ration of food and wine from his own kitchens. They were to be trained for 3 years, and then they would enter the royal service. Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were 4 of the young men chosen, all from the tribe of Judah. The chief of staff renamed them with these Babylonian names. Daniel was called Belteshazzar, Hananiah was called Shadrach, Mishael was called Meshach, Azariah was called Abednego. But Daniel was determined not to defile himself by eating the food and wine that was given to them by the king. He asked the chief of staff for permission not to eat these unacceptable foods. Please test us for 10 days on a diet of vegetables and water, Daniel said. At the end of the 10 days, see how we look compared to the other young men who are eating the king's food. Then make your decision in light of what you see. The attendant agreed to Daniel's suggestion and tested them for 10 days. At the end of 10 days, Daniel and his 3 friends looked healthier and better nourished than the young men who had been eating the food assigned by the king. So after that, the attendant fed them only vegetables instead of the food and wine which was provided for the others. God gave these 4 men an unusual aptitude for understanding every aspect of literature and wisdom. And God gave Daniel the special ability to interpret the meanings of visions and dreams. When the training period ordered by the king was completed, the chief of staff brought all the young men to King Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and no one impressed him as much as Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the royal service. Whenever the king consulted them in any matter requiring wisdom and balanced judgment, he found them 10 times more capable than any of the magicians and enchanters in his entire kingdom. The word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God. Thank you, Jordan. I invite you to turn with me in your Bibles to Daniel chapter 1. We'll be in verses 3 through 8 and 12 through 20 as we kick off what will be a new sermon series to many of you. If you were here 3 years ago, it will sound very familiar to you. As I mentioned last week, one of the things I tried to do in the summertime is to find an older sermon series and reboot it. Try to apply it to our current circumstances, and it was a no-brainer this time around. As I was thinking about it, as I was going through my old notes, it became very clear to me that we needed to go back and look at this study. I've entitled it, Darkness is No Obstacle, Holding On to God When the World Turns Upside Down. How many of you, show of hands, feels like the world has been turned upside down a little bit in the last few months? Yeah, unless you've been hiding under a rock, things are pretty crazy right now. Adrienne and I were talking about this standing in the foyer earlier, that every day there seems to be more bad news, there seems to be more danger, there seems to be more reason to fear, and there's an unspoken question among many of us is, when will life go back to normal, or will it ever go back to normal? And so as we move through this story, this very familiar story of Daniel and his 3 friends, what we're going to see is this is not the first time this has happened in the history of creation. We talk about, on the news today, we hear it said over and over again that life has changed. The world has changed forever. 2020 will go down in history as a year when the world was changed forever. But the same thing was happening in 605 BC. The world changed forever for the people of Israel. What happened was a king in Babylon by the name of Nebuchadnezzar, several years before that, had decided to expand his empire. And Nebuchadnezzar was a bully, and so he would go to other nations and he would say, you have a choice. You can see my army. We are the most advanced. We're the most well-equipped army in the world, and we will run you over. We will ruin your day from now until the end of your life, or you can become our ally and you can pay tribute to us. And so the king of Israel at that time agreed to pay tribute. And he did this for several years and things went fine. The Babylonians left them alone. But then the king of Israel started looking around and he looked at Egypt, and Egypt was saying, hey, we're pretty big and bad too, and we will charge you half the tribute that Babylon is charging you right now if you come over to our side. And so the king of Israel, as it turns out very foolishly, goes and says, Babylon, we'll see you later, we're not paying you anymore, our new best buddy is Egypt. And Babylon said, game on. And they came in and they wiped out Egypt in the blink of an eye. And then they laid siege to the city of Jerusalem, and they said, you are going to pay for your insolence. You are going to pay for your disobedience. And so for 3 months, nothing went into the city of Jerusalem, nothing came out. Does that sound familiar to anybody at all? Absolutely. You don't realize how long 3 months can be until you are locked down. And at the end of that lockdown time, finally, Jerusalem fell. They surrendered, and the Babylonians came swarming in, and they burned the city, and they knocked down the mighty walls, and they destroyed the temple, and then they took about 10,000 people back to Babylon with them. They took the best and the brightest, and they left behind them the elderly, the infirm, the people who were not the best and brightest, and said, you guys get to fend for yourselves. And so Daniel and his 3 friends were among this group of people that made about a 900-mile journey on foot to Babylon, where their new lives began. As we're going to see as we move through this study, there was a strategy at work. Satan had a strategy that he was using to destroy God's people. And that strategy, as we're going to see, has not really changed today. The first strategy is divide and conquer. Nebuchadnezzar goes in and he separates the people out into the haves and the have-nots. He wants the best and the brightest, the smartest, the best looking, the healthiest, and he takes them away to Babylon, and he tells everybody else who doesn't measure up, you no longer matter, breaking their will. The second thing he does is he decides to conquer by assimilation. So we're told in this passage he brings these boys in and he says, I'm going to educate you in Babylonian science and wisdom and literature. I am going to turn you into Babylonians. So rather than destroy you, I'm going to turn you to my side. And he begins to try to seek their favor and change their tastes by having them eat the same foods and drink the same drinks and live in the same quarters that the king himself lives in. So he conquers by assimilation. And if that doesn't work, then we have this last threat, which is eliminating all resistance, because everybody understood if you don't do what the king wants you to do, he's going to make your life very short, very painful, very ugly. The Babylonians were known throughout the world as masters of torture, masters of execution, and there were grisly reminders all over the cities showing what happens when you defy the king. You go back through and read the book of Esther, you will see that he was very, very fond of impaling people and leaving them dying in agony for days at a time in the public square. And so there was that threat. If you resist, you will be eliminated. It reminded me a lot of that old series, Mission Impossible, which I guess now is not such an old series. It's been a movie series for a number of years now, starring Tom Cruise. But if you remember, he's Ethan Hunt, the main agent for this particular show, is always presented at the beginning of each episode with this mission that seems absolutely impossible. And at the end, he's always given the caveat, your mission, should you choose to accept it, is this. And this message will self-destruct in 10 seconds. Daniel and his friends are faced with an impossible task, and God says your mission, should you choose to accept it, is going to be to continue to stand strong for me, despite these strategies that the enemy is using against you. We're going to see as we move through these next 5 weeks through the book of Daniel that these strategies that Satan used that have not changed are deceptively simple, but they're also somewhat difficult to overcome. So this week we'll be looking at the first strategy, which is identity theft. Week number 2, we'll see he has the performance trap. Number 3, the power play. Number 4, the popularity contest. And number 5, the integrity test. And so we begin with identity theft. I'm wondering how many of you have had the same experience that I have, where when you go out and you use your debit card, you get these annoying phone calls from your bank. Anybody else get those? Yeah, they say, we saw that you made a charge for $22.35 at Walmart in McPherson. Was this charge from you? And you just want to say, yes, of course it is. I go to Walmart all the time. Why are you calling me? Yeah, it gets extremely annoying, and I used to be tempted to really snap back at these people until one day, about about a year ago, lo and behold, they said, hey, we got this charge on your credit card, and we got this charge on your credit card, and this charge on your credit card, and these were significant amounts of money. And they said, are these yours? And I said, no, as a matter of fact, they're not. And they said, great, that's what we thought. We will take care of it. And it turned out somebody was trying to steal my identity. They were trying to use my assets, my money, my reputation in order to make their lives better and make my lives worse. And so all of a sudden I became very thankful for these people who were monitoring my financial activity. It was kind of an unsettling feeling. If you've ever had that happen to you, you start to question, okay, where did they get that? And are things going to be okay? And one of the things I had to do was cancel my credit card and my debit card and cut them up, and I had to wait for new ones to be issued. And so there was an interim period where I couldn't buy anything, and it was extremely troubling. And one of the things that I was glad to note as I was doing my research was that I'm not alone. The last data that I saw was from 2016, so it's been about 4 years ago, but apparently this happens to about 1 out of every 6 Americans, which translates to about 15 million people. And in 2016, there were about $16 billion in losses that took place. And one of the interviews I read with this particular woman who'd had her identity stolen characterized it as the most devastating, all-consuming experience of her life because someone had taken over my life. And if that hasn't happened to you, you say, you know, it's just money, it's not that big a deal, the bank will refund your money. But in that moment, it does feel absolutely devastating. It feels like somebody has taken a remote control and they have taken over your life. And this is what Daniel and his 3 friends were experiencing as well. Our foundational thought for this morning is that holding on in dark times, in times when it feels like Satan is running amok, when God is asleep at the wheel, we feel as if the world is out of control. When we hold on to these dark times, it requires, first of all, a commitment to living out our true identity no matter what else happens. Laura Story puts it really well. She says, if there's anything more exhausting than running from your enemies, it is running from your true identity in God. If there's anything more dangerous than waiting on God, it must be refusing to wait and taking your future into your own hands. Daniel and his 3 friends are faced with a very difficult choice for young men. The identity that you have in God, or this new identity that the Babylonians are offering you. The temptation of waiting for God's deliverance, waiting for God's perfect plan, or running away from it and doing our own thing because life is uncomfortable, because life is uncertain, because we are afraid. And it's the same choice that we are faced with today. So as we look at what the danger is this morning, we're going to see that there are 3 ways that Satan seeks to break our will during dark times. And those are thwarted goals, devalued values, and challenged beliefs. Our one-sentence sermon for this morning is that following Christ in dark times is a matter of the will as much as it is a matter of faith. And this story of Daniel and his 3 friends is designed to inspire us to get our wills out and to exercise those as much as possible. So we begin with the first passage here, verse number 4 that we look at. Nebuchadnezzar sees these boys, he sees these captive boys, and he says they're good looking, they're strong, they're intelligent, they're everything that we're looking for in converted Babylonians. And so he issues a decree and he says, bring them to me, bring them to the palace, and make sure that they are well versed in every branch of learning, that they are gifted with knowledge and good judgment, and that they are suited to serve in the royal palace. Train these young men in the language and the literature of Babylon. A number of years ago, a psychologist by the name of Seligman came along and he did some experiments on animals that today we would not allow. We would say they were cruel and they were unethical, but they became foundational in our understanding of motivation and of the ability to learn. And he set up this contraption. You can see a picture of it there in the graphic. And what he did was he created a small cage that was divided in half by a partition in the middle. It was a low partition so that the animal that was placed in the cage could easily move from one side to the other. But the floor of the cage was made of metal bars, and he hooked it up to electricity on one side and not on the other. So he would place the dog or the cat or the rat or whatever it was on one particular side, and he would shock them through the floor of the cage. And very quickly, the dog would learn, oh my gosh, if I get shocked, I just jump over the barrier, I go to the other side, and the shocks stop. And so he would run trial after trial after Eventually the dogs got to where they got put on the side and he didn't even have to shock them. They would just jump over to the other side and wait. Then he hooked up both sides of the cage to the electric shock. And so now the dog would get shocked, it would jump over to the other side, and the shocks would continue. And what he realized was that the dogs learned very quickly that if it didn't matter which side of the cage I was on, I was going to experience pain, I was going to experience frustration. They would eventually just lie down and they would give up. They would lie there and be shocked and whimper until the pain was over with. And what was even more interesting was that later Seligman would remove the electric shock and try to train the dogs to jump the barrier again, but at that point the dogs just gave up. They would just lay down, they would take the shocks, and Seligman called this learned helplessness. He said eventually when we're faced with pain that we feel like we can't control, that we can't get away from, we just lay down and take our shocks. And he applied this to human beings as well. And it's a concept that we use in counseling and in therapy with people every day, as we ask them, are you giving in to learned helplessness? Have you decided, I can't deal with my life, I can't fix what's wrong, I can't find a new way through, so I'm just going to lay down and I'm going to give up. The danger with thwarted goals is discouragement. Daniel and his 3 friends had every right to just lay down, take the electric shocks, and go with the flow. The temptation for us today is very similar. Seligman notes this in reflecting on his research results. He says, the belief that we can rely on shortcuts to happiness and joy and rapture and comfort and ecstasy rather than the exercise of personal strengths and virtues leads to legions of people who in the middle of great wealth are starving spiritually. And I think we're going to see more and more the repercussions of this as this COVID-19 crisis changes, as some parts of it pass, other challenges come up, as it drags on much longer than maybe we had hoped. We're going to see people who have run out of easy answers, and they're going to be forced to either ask deeper questions or to just lie down and give in to discouragement. Nebuchadnezzar's order says to train these young men. The word here in the Hebrew, lamad, means to goad. It means to use the rod of punishment as a teaching tool. So it's not training in the sense of let's learn our multiplication tables and we get a candy bar. It's a sense of I'm going to teach you this, and if you don't get it, you're going to get an electric shock. You're going to receive pain in return. There are times when the only way, sometimes when the best way to learn new lessons, to change our lives is through pain. It's through discomfort. It's through times of inconvenience. We see this same word used in Deuteronomy chapter 4 as Israel is moving into the promised land. God says to them, things are going to be difficult for you for a while. As you leave Egypt, things aren't immediately going to get better. You're going to have to go through the wilderness, but it's not because I'm capricious. It's not because I hate you. It's not because I don't care about you, but because I'm training you. I am giving you the rod of punishment now so that you can inhabit the land that I provided for you later. He says this, now, O Israel, listen to the statutes and the judgments which I am teaching you to perform. I am lamad. I am using my rod of punishment to change you. Why? So that you may live and go in and take possession of the land that the Lord is giving you. You see, God often allows thwarted goals, periods of time where we're not moving in the direction we would like to, periods of time when we're being shocked, we're being hurt, we're being inconvenienced, and it doesn't seem like anything we're doing is making a difference, to encourage us to overcome in His power. It is not easy, but it is vital in order for a mature faith to emerge. Our first key point is that Satan's hope is that thwarted goals will discourage us from the path. We'll just lay down, we'll take the shock, or we'll just jump out of the experiment altogether. We'll try to find that easy way out. But God's desire is that those thwarted goals will instead reorient us and strengthen our resolve to persevere. So our solution to thwarted goals, instead of discouragement, we need to practice stubborn obedience. I love this quote from C.S. Lewis from Mere Christianity. He says this, God knows our situation. He will not judge us as if we had no difficulties to overcome. What matters is the sincerity and perseverance of our will to overcome it. Where is your will this morning? Are you persevering sincerely? Are you seeking to overcome, or have you already given up in the face of thwarted goals? The second tool is devalued values. So they're brought to the palace, they're put through this rigorous training. The second thing they do is they say, your name is no longer what it was. Now you have a Babylonian name. You are no longer from Israel, you are Babylonian, and therefore you have a Babylonian name. James Marcia did some groundbreaking research back in the 60s and 70s on the formation of identity, and basically said teenagers move through this process of developing an identity. It's one of the reasons why teenagers are so volatile, they're so hard to understand, why they sometimes be really irritating to live with, is because they're developing a sense of identity. But he said there are 4 different places they can arrive in this search for identity, and only one of them is where we want to be. The first one, the first danger, he says, is what he calls identity foreclosure, where we have a lot of exploration going on and not a whole lot, or we don't have very much exploration going on, and we also have a lot of commitment. And so this is somebody who maybe has grown up in a family where they've said, you know what, your grandpa was a farmer, your dad was a farmer, you are going to be a farmer. And they say, okay, everybody says I'm supposed to be a farmer, I guess I'm supposed to be a farmer. Sometimes that works out really well. That person, you fast forward 50 years and they say, I really enjoy being a farmer, and I hope my kids decide to be farmers too. Other people reach the age of about 35 and they go, I really hate farming. Wish I would have gone to college and had fun with my friends. I wish I would have tried other things. And so about 35, they dye their hair pink and they get an earring and they walk away from their family and they decide to go surfing or decide to go follow a music group around the country, and they go back and they relive that adolescence that they never really lived. The second is what we call identity diffusion. This is where we don't explore and we don't commit either. So this is somebody who just kind of lays around and says, you know what, I don't care. Give me an identity, don't give me an identity. Let me explore, don't let me explore. I really don't care. We see this sometimes with very unmotivated teenagers, and these are the people whose parents bring them to me and they say, my kid just sits around and plays Xbox all day and sleeps till noon, fix them. And I have to say, okay, it's a little bit more complicated than that, but obviously we need to motivate them to try to find an identity. If we don't, these are the kids a lot of times that end up using drugs, they end up spending time in jail, they don't really get going with their life, they spin their wheels. The third one is what we call identity moratorium. This is where we have low commitment but high exploration. This is the person who changes majors 35 times when they go to college and they never really finish a degree, and maybe now they're 35 and I'm 3 hours short of my degree in culture and gender studies, but I haven't taken that class yet, but I'm pretty happy just to sit in the basement and watch Netflix and let mom and dad pay all the bills. And when you tell them, maybe it's time you went out and got a job, they say, I'm still thinking about what I'm trying to do. Don't push me, don't rush me. And sometimes you have to rush them. You have to force a decision to be made. So what we're looking for is this last category that we call identity achievement, where the exploration level is high and the commitment level is high. We're willing to look around, we're willing to try different things, but we also understand I've got to arrive at something at some point. And in the meantime, I'm going to try things and I'm going to make a commitment to take care of myself, to take responsibility for my identity. So that's what we are looking for. So one of the ways that Satan tried to thwart this with Daniel and his friends was the changing of their name. Names were much more important in the Jewish culture than they might necessarily be in our culture. We tend to just say, hey, I heard a really cool name today when I was out and about. Somebody called their kid this, and I think that's what I'm going to name my kid too. Or maybe you have a family name that you've passed down. It's just something that we like hearing, and so we name our child that. Jewish tradition, on the other hand, taught that the child's name was extremely important. It was the key to their soul. And in fact, some of the writers that talk about this say that a child's name in the Hebrew culture is a partnership between their parents' effort and God's response. In other words, they name this child, and it's their way of praying and saying, God, this is who we want our child to become. Please help this take place. So let's look at the names and what they mean. Daniel comes in with this Hebrew name that means God is my judge. God is the most important person in my life. I want to please God. And they change his name to Belteshazzar, which in Babylonian means Marduk, protect his life. Marduk was the principal Babylonian god, the god of fertility, the god of war, and so the god of strength. And they wanted Daniel to identify with Marduk rather than Yahweh. Hananiah in Hebrew means the Lord shows grace. Yahweh shows grace. They changed his name in Babylonian to Shadrach, which means under the command of Aku. Aku was the Babylonian god of the moon, the god of death, and so they wanted to twist Hananiah's identity. Mishael in Hebrew means who is like God. We changed that in English to Michael. So if you know somebody named Michael or Mike, that's what their name means. They changed this in Babylonian to Meshach, which means who is like Aku. Instead of who is like Yahweh, we say who is like Aku. And then the last one, Azariah, his name in Hebrew meant the Lord helps. Yahweh is a source of help. And they changed it to Abednego, which means the servant of Nebo. Nebo was the son of Aku. He was responsible for death and destruction. And so the danger here is that these boys give up too soon. They say, well, I can't even call myself Daniel anymore. Now I'm Belteshazzar, for crying out loud. What a silly name. But I guess I don't have any choice. I'm just going to give up. I'm going to give in. We're told here that the king had them renamed. The word here in the Hebrew, Swum Shem, means to put in place or to tread down, to change someone's reputation or their brand or their mark. And so we see that this is not an immediate process. It's not intended to be, but it's also intended to be something that's done by force. I would imagine these boys were punished when they called one another Daniel or Mishael, and instead they would smack them. They would say, no, your name is Belteshazzar now. Say it, Belteshazzar. Don't call yourself Daniel anymore. Don't call him Mishael anymore. He's Meshach. We are changing their reputation. And if you think about, if you've ever been around when you brand cattle, you know that that's a painful process. That brand has to burn through the hair. It has to burn through the hide. And it leaves a mark behind that never really goes away. This is almost always a painful process in the Bible, but it also is lasting. We see this same concept happen when Jacob's identity changes. If you remember the story of Jacob, he's a dishonorable person. He is a trickster. That's what his name means. And yet, when he wrestles all night with the angel of God to receive a blessing, he's told at the end, your name, your Shem, your reputation will no longer be Jacob, trickster, but it will be Israel, because you have struggled with God and you have overcome. And if you remember, what happened in exchange for that was the angel touched Jacob's hip. He broke Jacob's hip. And so from that point forward, Jacob walked with a limp. That was another sign of that change of identity. Some of you may be questioning your identity now. Maybe you've lost a job. Maybe you have lost a home. Maybe you've lost some of the things that you consider to be a part of who you are. And it's Satan's attempt to rename you, to change who you are, to brand or to mark you for himself. You see, anytime the worth of our faith or our mission is called into question, what's really happening is our identity in Christ is challenged. If I'm really a child of God, why are these bad things happening? If God really loves me and gave his son for me, why am I facing these struggles? And in the process, the God of this world continually offers new and counterfeit substitutes for a life of faithful service. Our second key point is that in a fallen creation, our identity begins to emerge, our true identity, as it is forged by the conflict between our faith and our circumstances. Identity, true identity, cannot emerge in a conflict-free environment. That's why we struggle with teenagers. That's why we struggle with God throughout our life, because our identity is emerging, and the outcome will depend on our willingness to fight for it. And what we see with these four boys, is that they are willing to fight. They're willing to stand up to the ruler of the entire civilized world and say, no, we will not follow you. We will follow the God of our Father. So the solution is determining we are going to fight for God's best. Tim Keller puts it this way. He says, if we take our meaning in life from our family, our work, a cause, or some achievement other than God, they end up enslaving us. Our values may be devalued, but we hold on to them nonetheless. The third is challenged beliefs. So they're in the palace. Everything's great. Life had to have been much nicer for Daniel and his three friends now than they were even during the best of times in Israel. And part of that is they get unlimited access to the king's kitchen. It's the best food. It's the best wine in the world. And so you would think they would say, well, I'm miserable. I got to go to school all day. I've got these really hard tests. They won't let me call myself by my name anymore, but at least I get to pick out several times a day. I'm going to enjoy this food. I'm going to escape. But we're told that Daniel was determined not to defile himself by eating the food and the wine given to them by the king. Instead, he asked the chief of staff for permission not to eat these unacceptable foods. Some of you have been around long enough that you remember the old Lay's potato chips commercial. They would actually have this man in a little devil costume come out, and his challenge was, I bet you can't eat just one. He would go around and people would say, of course I can eat just one. And they would take the chip out and they would eat it, and their facial expression would change, and they would begin compulsively taking chips out of the bag and eating everything and licking the inside of the bag. And we would laugh at that commercial, but there was some truth to that. One of the things that we study in my general psychology class is some of the strategies that are used by food producers today to get us not only to keep coming back and eating more of their foods, but to eat more of that food every time we're presented with it. A couple of concepts here. One of them is what we call hyperpalatability. This is a really fancy way of saying that they go to labs and they figure out how to target your taste buds in manufactured ways, in unnatural ways that normal food will not target them. That's why an Oreo tastes way better than a celery stick. It doesn't have the nutritional value to it. It's not natural food, but it's hyper-palatable. We eat an Oreo and we go, wow, I want more of that, so we eat another one. And hopefully the Oreo people are thinking you'll eat the entire package. I'm assuming nobody here does that with celery. You don't get yourself in trouble just compulsively. No, okay, I didn't think so. We eat celery and we go, okay, that's kind of gross, but I know I'm supposed to eat it, and so we eat it, and we get nutrition out of it. The second thing is what they call negative satiety. They, believe this or not, they actually go in and they engineer this food so that the more of it you eat, the hungrier you get. So it's not your fault that when you sit down with a bag of potato chips that you can't stop eating them, because the more you eat, the more you want them. And so one of the things that most of my students come to the conclusion of is that it's really better not to eat one Lay's potato chip, because you're not going to be able to stop, and you're going to want more and more and more. And this is the principle that Daniel is working from here. It's a danger with our challenged beliefs of having our tastes perverted. We see this illustrated in Genesis chapter 3, very early in the Bible. God puts Adam and Eve in the garden. He says, you can eat of every tree in the garden except for one. Leave this one alone. And the serpent comes to Eve and says, hey, check out the tree over here. And Eve goes over and she takes that first bite, and immediately hyperpalatability and negative satiety kick in. And we see that the woman says, when the woman saw that the fruit of the tree was good for food and it was pleasing to the eye and also desirable for gaining wisdom, she took some and she ate it. And we have been paying the price for that ever since. We're told that Daniel says that this food is unacceptable. The word here in the Hebrew, ga'al, means polluted. It means desecrated. It means soiled. It means not something I want to put in my mouth. But it's not just used to refer to food. It's used to refer to behaviors and to attitudes and to ways of living. God warns his people in Zephaniah 3, what sorrow awaits rebellious, polluted, ga'al, Jerusalem, the city of violence and crime. No one can tell it anything. It refuses all correction. It does not trust the Lord or draw near to its God. You see, the temptation is that Satan comes along and says, things aren't going real well. You're stuck at home. You're not able to go back to work. You have financial problems. Dabble in a little of this. It'll make you feel a little bit better. So one of the things I'm seeing in my counseling practice now is we're having this influx of people who have had ga'al dangled out in front of them, and now they've gotten hooked on it. People are drinking at unprecedented rates. I'm having people coming in going, I started drinking during the COVID thing and now I can't stop. These pornography companies who have paid access to their sites have dangled it out there, and they said, hey, for the COVID stuff, you can have free access to our sites. And they weren't doing that out of the goodness of their heart. They were doing that knowing that people were going to get hooked on pornography. And so I had people come into my office going, I can't stop looking at this stuff. It's messing up my marriage. It's messing up the rest of my life. What do I do? We've had unprecedented problems with weight gain during this time. People have talked about I've gained the COVID-15 or the COVID-35 or whatever it is, because we've just decided if I have to sit at home, then I might as well eat. I might as well forget about my problems. The point here is that the more we dabble in evil, the more inclined our taste for it becomes. becomes. Our tastes change. Habitual sin is a breeding ground for a rebellious heart that is easily drawn away from God. And so Daniel and his three friends say, we're not even going to take a taste. We're not even going to start down that road of unacceptable behavior. Our last key point this morning is that we are always faced with a choice, and that's a choice between how we feel and what is right. I don't know about you, but I don't always feel like doing what is right. Sometimes I really feel like doing things that are wrong. But the more we choose what's right, the less power our feelings have. Ignatius of Antioch puts it this way. He says it's impossible for a man to be freed from the habits of sin before he hates it, just as it is impossible to receive forgiveness before confessing his trespass. The question for us this morning is, am I continuing in the midst of my struggle, in the midst of these dark times, to cultivate a godly palate, or am I giving myself over to the temptations that Satan dangles in front of me? Three things to think about in conclusion. The first question to ask yourself this week, am I actively cultivating a holy stubbornness? We need to bear in mind that faith is a muscle and it has to be exercised in order to grow. So the question is, am I exercising my faith muscle, or am I just giving in to what's happening to me? Number two question, do I really believe that God's best for my life is worth fighting for? One of the things that I want us to think about as we move through this series is that there is a very distinct difference between earning salvation and putting effort into our sanctification, our process of becoming more like Christ. Salvation is a decision that we make. It's a gift from God. Sanctification is something that requires an investment of our time and our effort. And thirdly, are my tastes and desires more godly, or are they more worldly in nature? Remembering we are a product of our habits, and those habits can be both good and they can be bad. Let's pray. God, we thank you for the truth of your word. We thank you for this story this morning. We thank you for the assurance that the world is not turning upside down for the first time ever. That it's happened before, that you brought your people through it, and that you will bring us through again. I pray that you would give us the strength and the determination of will to hang on to you during these times of darkness and help us to emerge stronger and better and more faithful to you on the other side. And we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, I invite you to join us again next week when we move into week number 2 of our study of the book of Daniel. We'll look at the second tool that Satan uses, which is the performance trap. And if you want to read ahead, you can look in Daniel chapter 2 and prepare yourself for that. Be sure and wait in your seat for the ushers to come and dismiss you. If you'd like to visit, please go outside to do that. And put a pin in your memory somewhere about fireworks stand coming up. And if you have the time to volunteer for a shift working on that, we would ask you to do that as well. I'll leave you.
Brian, Ginger is here. Do you want to start that today?
Yes.
Okay, Ginger has the sign-up sheet, so.
Do you have it?
It's on the table.
Yeah, it's on the table.
Which table?
In the fellowship hall.
Okay, on the table in Fellowship Hall. So maintain social distance somehow. Go sign up. We ask you to do that. Yes, I leave you with this benediction from 1 Corinthians 15:58. Be steadfast and immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that in the Lord your labor is not in vain.